Hi, I'm Cedric.
And I'm Daniel.
So today we're doing a live Q&A to answer your questions about the top-of-the-line 2019 TVs. So which TVs do we have today, Daniel?
Yeah, so over on the left here we have the Samsung Q90R. So that's a 2019 model that's their highest end 4K TV. So there's the Q900R, which is an 8K model, but in their 4K lineup, this is the highest end one from 2019. In the middle here, we have the LG C9 Oled. So again, that's the 2019 OLED model from LG. That's the successor to the popular C8 from last year. And on the right-hand side, we have the Sony Z9F. This one was actually released towards the end of 2018, but it's currently their highest end 4K model in 2019 of the LCDs. So yeah, all the high-end top tiers from Samsung, LG, and Sony.
So today we're going to do the live Q&A for 30 minutes. In the first 20 minutes, we're only going to answer questions specific to those TVs. And then after that, we're going to open for the last 10 minutes for other questions that you might have for other TVs. So while we wait for your questions in the chat, let's start with a little bit comparisons between them. And let's talk about reflections.
Yeah, so the reflections for each of these TVs is pretty interesting. And we can actually show you. We'll turn off the TVs and put a light on each of them. And you'll be able to see, well, you should be able to see the differences between them. So on the left-hand side, we have the Samsung Q90R. In the middle is the LG C9, and on the right-hand side is the Sony Z9F. So first up, I guess the most noticeable difference is that the Samsung Q90R, it really diminishes the reflections a lot. So the anti-reflective coating is very effective. You can see a little bit of smearing towards the edges. So we'll also see that when we get to the Z9F. We expect that's the result of an optical layer that both of these TVs have to improve the viewing angles. In the center, the C9, on the right, the Z9F. Overall, the intensity of the reflections is in the same ballpark, but there's a few noticeable differences. The C9 has more of a purple tint to it, and the Z9F has this really long horizontal smearing that is a result of the viewing angle layer. Yeah. So overall, the Q90 is the best. The C9 and Z9F, they're both very good.
And the Q90 is the best that we ever measured as far as total reflections.
Yeah, which actually, it's impressive because the Q9FN from last year was very good. And this is another step of improvement above it. So it's definitely, it's impressive.
Do you think the smearing is going to bother some, or do you think overall it's still the best by far if you care about reflections?
Yeah, overall the smearing can be noticeable if you have direct lights on the TV. But in most cases, I don't think it will bother people. It's quite a low intensity, so it's really when the TV's off for a very dark scene and you have a bright light that's pointing at it. So overall, it's probably not too much of a problem for most people.
Okay. Then while we wait for questions, let's talk about viewing angles, which is also a big change for this year.
Yeah, so I'm going to turn the TVs on first. You won't be able to see the viewing angles in this video because fortunately we can't rotate them and show you what they look like. But overall, so the LG C9, it's got the best viewing angles of the three of them. The biggest difference compared to the other two models is that the gamma basically doesn't shift at an angle.
Yeah. So the colors hue though shift, right?
Yeah, they do. There's a bit of a tint that appears on the screen, which some people do find that bothers them. But for most people, probably the C9 is the best for viewing angles. The two other TVs, though, they actually have VA-type panels, which typically have bad viewing angles. But in these cases, they actually have an additional optical layer, which works to improve the viewing angles. And it's very effective. Definitely, it's in the same ballpark as IPS TVs. So for most people, the three of these will all be more than good enough.
And then another big difference is the dark scene performance. So how does it compare for these three TVs?
Yeah, so the standout difference here is that the C9 is an OLED, so it can produce perfectly deep blacks. It can basically turn off the pixels completely. The two other LCDs, though, they are helped by the local dimming. So although they can't turn off the zones on a per pixel basis, they can still turn off groups of pixels or zones. And this results in still a very good dark scene performance. But the way that this local dimming is implemented is a bit different between the two flagship models. On the Q90, it's quite an aggressive local dimming, which means that some small highlights or small areas will actually be crushed. So you might lose some details there. And I believe this is actually a choice that Samsung has made. And the reason is that for many people, it will result in excellent looking dark scenes.
Less blooming, definitely,
yeah.
Which is a big plus for a lot of people. But there's a downside to it though.
Yeah, you do lose some details as a result, but if you care about like perfectly deep black bars or just when you're watching, space scenes, movies that have a lot of dark areas, then it does look very impressive because it can produce these perfect blacks. The Z9F, on the other hand, it's I guess the priorities of the local dimming algorithm are a little bit different, so it's much more accurate. So you do retain these dark scene details more, but as a result, there's also a bit more blooming because rather than turning off the backlight to try and reduce the amount of blooming, the Z9F, it's got a more accurate image.
We have a question that is relevant to dark scene from Brad H. Does the near black prominence overshoot issue still exist on the C9 like it did on the 2018 OLEDs? I don't want to be seeing flashing macro blocking during the Game of Thrones anymore.
So maybe we actually, we were just having a look at it on the C9
just a few
not
minutes
long
ago.
And I'm not sure it's worth bringing up now because I don't think you'll be able to see it with the exposure of the camera. But we did see it a little bit, definitely not as much as we saw in the C8. The other interesting thing though, we found with the C8, when we were replicating this issue, that we found it happened on our B8, C8, E8, and A9, I think we tested it on.
Yeah, the Sony, yeah.
Yep, and all of them experienced this issue, but it was a little bit different depending on the individual panel, I guess, or in the case of the C9, we did see it, but it wasn't much. It was just there a little bit.
So what about gaming?
Yeah, gaming is another interesting area because the Q90, as with other sort of high-end flagships from Samsung for the last year or so, they have a few extra features. So in fact, I can open it up on the menu. So they have a whole section of gaming features, basically, that some of them include variable refresh rate. There's also, it can interpolate low frame rate content with low input lag. So it means if you're playing, for example, 30 FPS games, then you can interpolate it up to 120 Hertz and the input lag remains low, which is definitely something that a lot of people like. You can see that, so Game Motion Plus settings, these blur reduction and judder reduction, they're the low input lag interpolation.
Yeah, I'm not sure we see it well on the screen though, so it might not be worth
might be overblown, yeah. And there's also the FreeSync option. I'm going to turn off game mode so that you can see the screen again.
Oh, but yeah, even then it's a bit hard to see on the screen.
I'm in the way, of course. Okay, the C9 as well, it supports variable refresh rate, but we found that we could only get it to work on the Xbox One S that we've got. And the reason is it's a different type or standard of variable refresh rate, which is the HDMI 4 variable refresh rate. So at the moment, there's almost no devices that support it except for the Xbox, I think. So you can't use it with your NVIDIA graphics card or your AMD PC. So that's a bit of a downside. And the Z9F, it doesn't support either of those variable refresh rate features.
What about input lag?
Yeah, so the input lag, that's pretty interesting because the input lag of the C9, we also retested that today with the latest firmware update.
Yeah, so we published a review of the C9 on the website this morning, but we did the review with the firmware of from 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, 2 or 3 weeks ago. So basically when we start testing a TV, we want all our results to be I guess, self-consistent. So we actually, from start to finish, before we test the TV, we update to the latest firmware, but then we leave it on that same firmware version throughout the rest of our testing. And then later on, because we keep the TVs, we can go back and retest specific areas. So in the case of the C9, we tested it with the latest firmware from about 2 or 3 weeks ago, which was when we started testing it. And now there's a newer firmware update, and it's actually dropped the input lag.
Yeah, we can show it on the screen.
Yeah. So you can see here we've retested. So the latest firmware is 35031. And some of the notable changes here are 1080p 60 input lag of just around 13 milliseconds and 4K 60/444, so that's in PC mode for those PC gamers, again about 13 milliseconds. And the 120 input lag has also dropped a little bit, so between 6 and 7 milliseconds, which is excellent. So overall that should be excellent for basically anyone. In the case of the Q90, that also has low input lag. I don't know if it's, actually I'll bring up the review now and we can check how it compares. So the Q90, the input lag's in the same ballpark. So the LG had about 13.5 milliseconds, the Q90 is about 15 milliseconds. So really that's not a noticeable difference. So the Q90 also has exceptionally low input lag, again with VRR or 120 Hertz, it's even lower, which is great. And the Z9F.
Yeah, this is the one that Sony is kind of lacking compared to the rest, right? For all the gaming features, it's in a little bit behind.
Yeah, and in the past, the Sony TVs actually had, in some cases, it was pretty bad input lag, like 40 milliseconds for 1080p signals. It seems like that's more of a priority now, that the Z9F is about 21 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, but it still is a bit higher than the TVs from other brands.
Yeah, like the 20 milliseconds, Samsung had that like 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, really, the input lag for Samsung TVs, they've stayed consistently low for a few years. For LG, about 2 or 3 years, I think.
They started improving it. Yeah. But definitely below like 15 milliseconds, there's almost no difference between models. You could still get a little bit lower compared like to monitors, but there's not a big difference left.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because it seems like something that manufacturers are focusing more on now. So it's less of a differentiator that it used to be. For example, Samsung TVs would have a low input lag, so many gamers would go with those. But now it's more TVs across the board seem to be getting better, which is definitely a good thing.
So we have a question from KIOP901. Does the Q9 work with Radeon cards for VR?
No, it doesn't. And the reason is that, yes it does. So via HDMI it does. With NVIDIA it doesn't. And the reason is that the NVIDIA drivers don't support HDMI. So the variable refresh rate on NVIDIA at the moment only works via DisplayPort. But if you can do FreeSync via HDMI, then the Samsung works with it.
Okay, another question that related to gaming from a serious Xfication. Have you also retested 120 Hz BFI? That was one of the LG CES promises.
No, we haven't with the latest firmware. So we tested it with a firmware as of 2 or 3 weeks ago.
And it didn't, right?
And it didn't work. So the BFI, it basically just every second frame was turned off. So it was a...
so it worked in 60 Hz, but not 120 as advertised.
That's right. So we will definitely test that, and we will update our review and put a notice whether or not anything changes there.
So kind of related also to gaming, a question from Tasso KIGO. How does it compare in motion with Plasma Panasonic VT60 last generation? So motion of these TVs compared to the latest of the Plasma.
So overall, motion is quite a complicated subject, and it's handled very differently depending on the type of TV. So plasmas are different to LCDs and different to OLEDs. So if you really like one specific type of motion, then you're unlikely to be satisfied by any other
like I wouldn't say plasma is better. It's more different from motion. They flicker more, but they flicker the subfield flickering. So it's not full frame flickering. So it's like just colors at the time that flickers, which gives a different kind of motion. So it's not like full BFI like on OLED, which is like perfect BFI. It's more of a in between the two. So some people like it, some don't. It's not really better. It's just different. Same thing with like the motion on LCDs versus OLED. LCDs has the advantage that since there's a response time, so since there is blur, it actually looks a little bit smoother than TOLED, which have a more sudden transition.
Yeah.
So it depends what you care more about.
Yeah, overall the biggest thing is the type of motion that suits your preferences and what you really care about.
Question from Philip Alquist. Any info on VR with the C9? Any subjective indication of stuttering due to limits of VR range?
So we tried it out with an Xbox and we were able to confirm that the VRR works, but unfortunately, because we're not able to do our same battery of tests via the Xbox as we do via a PC usually, we weren't able to test things like the VRR range or what happens at the edges of that limit. So unfortunately not at the moment.
Yeah, it's kind of hard with the Xbox to test these corner cases scenario, right?
Yeah, you can't really set up the same controlled conditions to be able to evaluate it.
So let's talk about brightness between of these three TVs.
Yeah. So speaking of brightness, I think the C9, it dims when there's no change. So I think that might have dropped down a bit, but they were set to about the same brightness. So overall, the biggest difference between them is actually one of the main differences between LCD and OLED TVs. And that's that an LCD TV with a good backlight, so like these high-end ones, can get exceptionally bright. The whole screen can get very bright. I think each of these, they can hit well over 1,000 nits, maybe even 1,600 nits or so, I'm not sure exactly.
It seems to definitely vary a lot depending on the pattern. Between the Q90 and the Z9F, some patterns, one wins, the other one wins, so it depends.
Yeah, but overall, both of these TVs are exceptionally bright, which is great. If you like bright, vivid HDR, they're both a great choice. Or if you're just in a room with a lot of lights and you want to crank up the backlight to overcome some glare, they're both excellent choices. The C9, it's still a bright TV, but the big difference is the ABL, which basically means that the whole screen can't get bright. So I think the whole screen of the C9 is limited to about 150 nits or thereabout, 160. Maybe I can...
Yeah, something like that, but it seems to vary also depending on the settings.
Yeah, in the case of the C9, it does vary depending on the settings. It's... you can read our additional review notes if you want to see more about that, but it seems like there's ways with the settings to bypass at least some of the ABL.
Yeah, they did introduce, though, on the C9 a new feature to control the ABL, right?
Yeah, they did. I'll bring that up now so you can see it.
Hopefully we'll see it well on the camera.
So I forget which menu.
So it's a new setting that last year OLED didn't add. Now Sony added kind of similar settings on their OLED.
Yeah, it doesn't work exactly the same way. On the C9, even with peak brightness set to off, so this kind of, in general, it boosts the brightness of smaller areas. On the A9 from last year, it was basically you could enable or disable ABL, which meant that when it was turned off, the whole brightness would stay, the whole screen would stay the same brightness no matter what the content. On the C9, it doesn't quite work in the same way. Even when it's off, you will get changes in brightness, but they're just a lot less noticeable. So, for example, you get about the 150 nits with the full screen, but I think about double that on smaller areas. Whereas on high, it can basically quadruple or more. It can get up to, I think, 800 or 900 nits for small highlights. So this basically changes the amount of ABL. If you find the change in screen brightness bothers you, then you should basically disable it or set it to a lower setting. But if you want the screen to be as bright as possible and the brightest highlights, then turn it to high.
So let's talk briefly about uniformity, and then after that we're gonna just answer questions from the chat. There's someone that asked a question kind of related to uniformity, saying, so it was Matthew that asked, have they fixed the vertical bending of OLEDs yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. Overall, it's hard to say because we found it varies a lot between units.
Yeah.
So as an example, we bought 6 of the OLED C7 for our burn-in test, and some of them had sort of bad noticeable vertical banding and other ones not so much, that it wasn't really problematic. And it even changed over time that throughout the more than the year we've been running it, the pattern of banding has actually changed a little bit. So because we only have one unit here, it's really hard to say. Our impressions of this unit are it does definitely seem to be better than the C8 we've seen, or the
But it might
B8,
be
but-
just luck.
yeah.
We don't really know for that. It varies a lot.
Yep, yep.
And you mentioned that it varies over time, but it doesn't really necessarily worsen over time. It changes. It could be worse like for like a week, then after that it becomes better for a week. It's kind of hard to say.
Yeah.
It just keeps changing for this.
So overall with the C9, we won't really know until we get some more feedback from readers and other people that have bought it, or I guess when we buy the B9 or the E9.
Yeah, true. But yeah, if you have a C9, just send us a picture of the uniformity, and then that way we can compare and see what's the variance between models. What about the uniformity on the Q90?
Yeah, so we actually found it was pretty bad for the dirty screen effect.
Yeah. Are you able to show the maybe put like a 50% gray on it? But yeah, definitely, like it seems like kind of a recurrent issue for all Samsung full array, right? That they are all pretty like bad for dirty screen effect.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because this is one area that we've actually found that they're sort of lower end models that the lower end models that don't have full array local dimming actually tend to perform better in. So I'm going to bring up a 50% gray pattern here.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we're going to see it well in the camera.
Here we go.
But definitely in person we see that the Q90 has more issues than the rest.
Yeah, so most noticeable is there's some blotchiness around the screen, and the edges also get a bit darker. In the case of the C9, there are changes in the color temperature. So depending on where you're looking at the screen, there are small variations, but overall it's much better. And in the case of the Z9F, you can see a little bit of dirty screen effect in the form of some small amounts of banding near the top left. And the corners also get a little bit darker, but it doesn't look to be as bad as the Q90.
Okay, so let's answer questions from the chat. We have 10 minutes left. So we have a question from Mike Miller related to peak brightness. He says, there's a conspiracy theory that says your SDR HDR peak brightness scoring is inconsistent. Two different real scene versus peak and sustained numbers. Can you explain those discrepancies?
Okay, so overall...
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Because it's actually really hard to measure brightness. It changes a lot depending on the pattern used, right?
Yeah, it does. In some cases, many TVs, for example, on 10% windows, that will be the brightest that they get. So when you basically display a window that covers 10% of the area in the center of the screen, some TVs will just peak their brightness and get very high results, but you won't actually see that in real scenes. So if you look at these numbers, sometimes it's hard to relate them to the real scene performance because, for example, the Samsung TVs from last year and the year before, they would often peak the brightness on certain windows and get very high numbers, like 1600 nits. But then if you wait for 10 seconds or so, it would drop down to 600 nits or so.
Even these TVs, so right now for all the peak brightness measurements, we measure it over time, right?
Yeah,
and see,
that's right.
make sure it doesn't vary too much over time, and then we record all of that.
Yeah, so we actually collect data. So we do continuous readings for 3 minutes for each of the window sizes. And basically what we do that for is to see how the pattern varies. If it's really just a one-off burst that's a high brightness that you won't experience in a real scene, or if it can actually sustain that brightness. And that's why on our reviews, I can show you the screen here. We actually have 2 numbers for each peak brightness window. So on the 2% window, for example, we have a peak brightness number of 906 nits for SDR and a sustained number of 750 nits. And what that means is that at some point the TV was able to reach 906 nits of brightness, but then over time it actually decayed down to 750 nits.
Maybe even if we could have waited longer, it could have been a different number, right?
Yeah, for example, on OLED TVs, if you keep a continuous pattern up for a long time, then it will continue to decay. It will, and you can probably see that throughout this video, that every now and then the C9 with static content, it will get a bit darker.
Yeah. So yeah, alta brightness, it's kind of hard to measure because of that. So for a real scene pattern, we actually put the patterns up. I think it's even on YouTube on the SDR pattern, right? But if you look at the mouse over, you can see on our website, you can actually have access to the pattern that we use. It's not the perfect pattern, it's just one pattern. We find that it somewhat correlates well to normal content, but obviously you are able to find the content that doesn't correlate. So there's room for improvement in our test for brightness, but it's really hard to test because there is a lot between time, between scenes, and there's a bunch of stuff going on. Even like the different HDR info frame, right, is going to make the brightness varies a lot.
Yep. And another thing that can be a bit confusing, or definitely isn't intuitive on the website at the moment, is our SDR peak brightness score. So when you see a score of 8.9 for the Q90, that's actually a weighted average of each of the components below it. And within that weighted average, we actually weight the real scene highest. And the reason is that that corresponds best to what you'll find in normal content. So in some cases, for example, the 10% window might be very bright, but if the real scene isn't bright, then the score might be a bit lower. So yeah, that's definitely something that maybe we can expose a little bit more in the future, how these weights are built up and what the components are.
Yeah, we should probably also add a test of the max possible brightness uncalibrated, because all of these numbers, it's calibrated, but we should probably put like in dynamic mode with the cool color temperature, how high we can get just for like a certain amount of time. That would be cool that if we add it.
Yeah, because with that, we basically test all TVs under the same conditions, which means that we use a 6500 Kelvin. It's the standard that movies are mastered at. And that can affect the brightness readings. For example, on some of the LG TVs that have WRGB panels, often the white subpixels used to boost the brightness, but it tends to have a cooler color temperature, which means that when you set it to 6500 Kelvin, the overall screen actually gets a little bit dimmer as a result. So we use these same conditions to test all TVs, but that doesn't mean that it's the brightest you can get it. In some cases, things like the dynamic mode, as you mentioned, or different color temperatures, they might have a higher brightness in some cases.
And also not to forget, there's definitely a diminishing return. Once you get above, like it's 1,000 nits TV versus 1,100 nits TV, there's almost no difference. Yes, maybe side by side you're gonna see a little bit of difference, but besides that, there's a definitely diminishing return there. So a question from Bjorn Ensen. Has the ABL of the C9 been improved from the 2016 generation? He's thinking of replacing his B6 with the C9.
Yes, it has. So the B6, I remember when we tested it, we tried with a video game, I think, I forget what it was, like a Call of Duty or something. And if you look up towards the sky and the whole screen gets bright, compared to looking at the ground, you can see a big difference from the ABL. I think LG started to improve that in 2017, it got a bit better. 2018 again was another improvement, that the 100% window could get brighter. In the case of the 2019 model, the biggest change is this peak luminance feature, I think it was called. Or
the one that we just showed a few minutes ago. Definitely that you can control it is a big thing. But even if you leave it at max, you will see it sometimes. Like for example, sometimes I watch a movie and then some scene transitions, you're gonna see it, but it's pretty rare that it happens unless you are using really some specific stuff, or if you're using it as a PC monitor where you have like a white window, then definitely it's gonna be a lot darker than the rest of the content. So it shouldn't be an issue for most people.
I realize that actually something we haven't spoken about at all is the HDMI 2.1 support of some of these TVs. Maybe we could have mentioned that I forgot to mention it when we were talking about the gaming features earlier. But the interesting thing, one of the problems with testing HDMI 2.1 at the moment is that there are no sources available that support it. So we aren't actually able to do good tests of it on these TVs. But both the Q90 and the C9 are advertised to support HDMI 2.1, whereas the Z9F isn't. So if you want absolute future-proofing with some of these higher bandwidth signals, then that might be a consideration. But at the moment, it doesn't really make a difference because, as I said, there's nothing available that supports HDMI 2.1.
A question from Jonathan Gimon that asks, I think a lot of us are wondering if the motion interpolation is better on the C9 compared to C8. Is there still shimmering around moving objects?
So that's sort of a tough question to answer because we don't have a objective tests for motion interpolation.
So officially, like on a review, you're only gonna say that if it supports motion interpolation at 60 or 120 Hz, but we don't qualify officially the performance.
We do display some of the same scenes on all TVs and turn on motion interpolation to note things like people that are fans of motion interpolation. I think one of the biggest bothers they have is when TVs stop interpolating. That some TVs will continue to do it no matter what, so you end up with a smooth image. Some though, when it gets too difficult and there's too many artifacts, they'll stop. I think in the case of the C9, I'll have to check on our review, but I think it just continues interpolating, so you don't end up with changes to the frame rate.
But there's definitely still some blocking around moving objects. It's kind of a flaw in all motion interpolation. Personally, I'm a big fan of interpolation, and for this, I find that usually Sony TVs are the best for this. They have less frame drops, and there's some blocking. Definitely, like if there's like a fence and someone moving behind the fence, then this could be like a whole mess. But personally, I still always leave it higher, at least on Sony. The rest, I'm not that big fan of.
And actually, just a correction from before. In the case of the C9, we did find that it stops interpolating at some point. So if you have a particularly difficult scene, then you will end up with a changing frame rate as it interpolates some points and then stops.
Well, I think Adam mentioned that we made a small error that the Q90 doesn't support HDMI 2.1, at least officially, or something like that.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Okay, so just a clarification, in the case of the Q90, it hasn't been, the only indication of a different feature that we've seen is that the fourth HDMI port supports 4K at 120 Hz with 420, which can actually fit under the HDMI 2.0 bandwidth, but for some reason it's only the fourth port on this TV, and it's something that we haven't really seen on other TVs except for the Q900, which was advertised for HDMI 2.1 and also supports that resolution. So we don't know if it's going to be updated for HDMI 2.1 or not. It's probably not something to wait for because it might not ever happen. But that's kind of an indication that there's something a little bit different about the fourth port on the Q90.
So we're already at the half an hour time mark, but we're going to extend a little bit Q&A for 5 minutes because there's a lot of questions that we haven't answered, which unfortunately we're not going to be able to answer all of them, but at least if we answer a few more for the next 5 minutes, that would be good.
Just to follow up with that, if you have any more questions, then feel free to post on the discussions at the bottom of the review. We're very active on there. We try to answer every single question. So if there's things that we don't cover here or haven't covered in the review, then definitely let us know.
Yeah, definitely. So a question from Migansmo. On the Samsung Q90R, does PWM flickering produce motion duplication on game mode at the lower backlight settings? So this is yes. All PWM will produce duplication. The duplication would vary on the frequency. Basically, highest frequency, the more you can see, but the less apparent they will be. But PWM will cause duplication no matter what. Definitely a lower backlight.
Yeah, but in the case of the Q90R, it can actually drop the black frame insertion frequency to 60 Hertz, which minimizes the amount of, basically produces the clearest image for 60 Hertz content. So it's a good result there.
Yeah, if you want to use that feature. Good, so, interesting question from Pete Stradamus. How close did the Q90R get to the OLED now, picture quality-wise?
Yeah, so definitely it seems like there's, it's moving towards a convergence, I guess.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised by the Q90. It's been a while that LCD, like I thought like maybe like 2 years ago they're starting plateauing except like extra brightness. But there's definitely a very cool improvement this year that happened.
Yeah, so some of the most noticeable changes. So the OLEDs in the past always had very good viewing angles other than the color shift, but the Q90 has improved on that. Now it's very good. The local dimming is also very good. It was a bit of an improvement over the Q9FN, which definitely helps for the dark scene performance. One of the big downsides though is that as we mentioned a bit earlier, the local dimming is a bit aggressive, so it does result in crushed details in some scenes. And as far as brightness goes, the LCDs, they can produce bright highlights.
So still in completely the dark room, OLED still wins, especially for dark scenes. But like if you have a living room, and especially with like windows, then Q90 is better than OLED for this case. So a question from kind of related from Radeon Kadir. Do you suggest a Q9FN over Q90R?
So overall, there are some differences between them. As mentioned before, the Q90R has better viewing angles, so if that's something you care about, then it's definitely a good thing. Also has a faster interface, so overall the smart features work a bit better, it's a bit more snappy, that's good.
Better reflections?
Yeah, better reflection handling. So in most areas, the Q90R is a better TV, but in dark scenes, some people might still prefer the Q9FN. And the reason is that the additional optical viewing angle layer, it actually reduces the native contrast ratio a bit. So if you're in the dark, you might notice that difference between them.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a big difference, but like if you are really just into dark, then Q9FN would be better. But besides that, Q90 is an improvement in almost all of the ways. And yeah, and a little bit less aggressive local dimming too, which is really a good thing.
Yeah.
So we're only going to take one more questions for today. But as Daniel mentioned, if you have more questions, just go into reviews on the website and you can post questions there. And we usually answer within a day or two for most questions. And also other people also of the community that answers, then that could help you with this. So question from, maybe to do a good closure, from Sam Parker. Ratings, what would your daily driver TV be? So let's say between these three TVs, Daniel, which one would you use at home?
That's a good question. In the past, on these live Q&As, I've mentioned that I actually do care about the viewing angles, that because of my viewing situation, I'm off to the side. But now we have three TVs that actually have good viewing angles, so that's an improvement. It's a tough pick. Overall, probably the Q90R. It's
why?
It's a solid overall TV. None of the gaming features are nice. I don't game a lot, but when I do, it's nice to have the features. Yeah, it's just a great overall TV.
Okay. For me, though, I mostly just watch movies in the dark, so I would go for the C9 because I care more about the dark scene performance, and I don't have much light in my room. Viewing angle, I care a little bit because sometimes if I'm on the side of the sofa, on a VA panel, it's bad. But yeah, we'll go for the C9, better dark scene performance.
Actually, I should have mentioned too that I don't actually have curtains, so the better reflections of the Q90 is a big bonus.
Okay. So that's going to be it for today. So thanks everyone for joining us and asking questions in the chat. It was pretty fun. I liked it.
Yeah. Thanks for coming along and getting involved. It's good.
And I think we're going to publish our next review video. I think, do we have the Q90R yet for the video review?
We have filmed it, but we haven't published the video. Probably within the next 2 weeks or so, that will be.
And then after that, the C9, we're going to do a full video review also on it, right?
Yes, but that will take a few weeks. So it's in the works, but it takes us a bit of time to do those and all the filming, the editing, the script writing, it all. Yeah.
Cool. So thanks everyone.
Cool. Thanks for watching.